The Insurrection Act authorizes the U.S. president to deploy military forces within the United States to suppress rebellion, domestic violence, or to enforce federal law in certain circumstances. To help us understand more about how this act works, we welcome James Sample, professor at Hofstra Law School and an ABC News contributor. Thank you so much for coming back again. So let's just start off with the basics. When is the Insurrection Act intended to be invoked?
The Insurrection Act is intended to be invoked only extraordinarily rarely. It is very broadly and ambiguously written. It gives the president, no matter who the president is, a lot of power. You might argue that the Insurrection Act is dangerous in the hands of any president, whether you like the president or not. It authorizes the authorization of the domestic use of the military in civilian affairs, so civilian law enforcement, in three situations. If the governor or legislature of a state requests it because they need to suppress an insurrection, or if the president wants to invoke the Insurrection Act without state consent, he can do so if it is impossible to enforce federal law through normal means, which is the argument that the president is advancing, at least somewhat tentatively so far. And then finally, in a third situation, if it is impossible to enforce federal law because the state is standing in the way of enforcement.
So give us a sense historically of when this has been invoked properly. It
certainly was the last time, as your piece indicated, when it was invoked in 1992, about 33 years ago, was the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. And that was at the request of California gubernatorial officials and other officials in the state of California. This has been invoked a few times in instances where you might say they were certainly with salutary effects. So the civil rights era in the 50s and the 60s, it was part of the effort to integrate the schools, for example. You needed the federal military force to make that kind of thing happen. But this is a very, very rare scenario.
Is it legal for the president to use the U.S. military against American citizens?
Well, last week you heard him in his address to the troops refer to American citizens as the enemy within. There has been, as much as there are technical legal aspects of the Insurrection Act and the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a statutory prohibition on the use of military officials for civilian law enforcement purposes, the Insurrection Act is an exception to that Posse Comitatus Act. If you think about the, classic Western films where the sheriff of the county, the lawman, if you will, gets a posse. It is the posse of that county that goes to, pursue the unlawful individuals. That is the purpose of a Posse Comitatus, but the Posse Comitatus Act prevents the military from being used in that particular way.
Explain for us the difference between the Insurrection Act and martial law.
Martial law, there is actually no constitutional basis for martial law in the United States of America, and the Insurrection Act does not allow for martial law. Martial law is where the military replaces civilian law enforcement as opposed to assisting civilian law enforcement.
James Sample, always appreciate your explanations and insight. Thank you so much. Coming up, LeBron James hinted at a second